Yeah, it's working. Hopefully my connection will be a bit better from now on because I changed computers, so I don't need to use one of those USB Wi-Fi things that is so crappy. Hopefully it's better. I don't know how we should do this today, though. I mean, we never stopped to read something together.
Yeah, did we want to read passages or just discuss the text? Because I did read the chapter you sent beforehand.
You read the chapter, right? Yeah, I mean, I'm imagining we're actually going to discuss the actual content of the text, right? Not like some general presentation thing, right?
Yeah, I'm just opening it now.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, maybe you should share your screen and have the text open.
Good idea. Just 1 second.
I initially read the other Tektology book. Do you know what the difference? Because it's kind of the same text, but with many
small. Yeah, just share the screen here. The different, from what I know, is that the Tektology book was actually meant to be 3 books, and apparently in Russian you actually have the 3 books. So there is another file. I think we have it also on. There is this other one that no, it's not this one. Yeah, there is another text called Tektology, book 1.
Yeah.
Which I think is just a bit more detailed because it's not a summary. It was published before, but he didn't make it shorter to fit everything in one book. So sometimes it's a bit longer. And I think there is something in that book that it's not in this one. Let me just check again here on the, where is the summary? Yeah, in this version here, there is a lot of stuff missing that is actually quite interesting, but I don't think I have it. I have the other book here for some reason. Let's see if it's here. It should be here, but yeah, I don't remember. I don't have the other version, but if you look in the summary, it has some other kind of specific discussions that are very, very interesting, especially one that I think it's particularly interesting. I don't think it's in this book yet, which is at the end of the book. There's an appendix called the organization of labor or something like this, where he applies everything to a sort of redescription of the labor process and how energy consumption and labor are connected, and he makes some weird calculus of how many calories a worker needs, and how like he tries to substitute monetary discussion of circulation with the energetic discussion, where things that should circulate in society are quantified in terms of amounts of calories that you can actually consume and things like this. It's pretty amazing and weird, which I think is actually a good way to describe him in general. Like I mentioned in the group, one thing that really I've never really stopped to realize, but I think this guy is the only Soviet Marxist I know of that actually died because of stuff that he actually did, not like got killed by Stalin, committed suicide. He actually, I mean, he died for different reasons. So the only kind of figure in late 20s that I could think of in that situation. Okay, let me just do something here.
And it was a really crazy way, right? It was with a blood transfusion.
Yes, he created an institute to study blood transfusion. And then he did a blood transfusion between him and a guy with meningitis to see if his blood would cure the other person. And no, that didn't happen. So that's how he died.
That's amazing.
Yeah, he was looking for like immortality or something, one of those cosmist projects in Russian philosophy.
I read that the other guy was actually he got better. It was Bogdanov that died.
No way, really?
Yeah, because the other guy got Bogdanov's blood, and apparently Bogdanov had been getting like people were commenting on how much younger and healthier he looked from the other transfusions.
Mm-hmm.
So then he gave his blood to this guy who was like a student, and he got better, but Bogdanov got the infected blood and it killed him. And there's also speculation that it might have been wrong blood types because they didn't understand that at the time.
I see. Yeah, the guy, I mean, I really recommend, there is a new biography out called Red Hamlet. I think I have the PDF somewhere. I can upload it. I don't have it here with me because I just changed computers, but I'll upload it later on. But it's this one here by James White. For some reason, these are the nice pictures, but it came out through Brill. It's really, really good. It's a bit like I was a bit frustrated with it because they say they're gonna give a sort of intellectual history of his project, and you don't really get that. There's not like a really serious engagement with what he was doing, but it's a really, really good kind of overview of his life and different moments in his life. There is another book which I think is really good called Beyond Marx and Mach, which is also, it's a more detailed analysis of Bogdanov's work. I was reading it today. It's I mean, again, it's not something that you say, whoa, but it's very useful and more detailed, especially on that point. Like the book criticizes that Bogdanov was kind of established as that guy that was not Lenin, and the guy Lenin was arguing with. And there isn't very much of a sort of immanent or intrinsic approach to what he did. And so the book tries to do a bit of that, tries to show exactly where he's breaking with kind of Soviet early philosophy, how is his position different, and in a less caricatured way, but it's still, I mean, I still think that for better or worse, because it was a very kind of tendentious presentation, the way that Mackenzie Warp talks about Bogdanov in her book Molecular Red, she discusses four theorists, right? Bogdanov, Platonov, then Kim Stanley Robson, and Donna Haraway. And it's a sort of the whole project is more contemporary and more driven by contemporary politics. So Anthropocene and things like this. And she really suggests that Bogdanov has something to add. But it's interesting that even though I think it's the most creative use of his philosophy, most, let's say, fresh, there is one very specific point that anyone who reads her work will see that is curious, which is in one of his books, I think in this one called Philosophy of Living Experience, which was written in 1910. So it's a bit before Tektology. He talks about the labor point of view. he gives a definition of nature that is dependent on the idea of labor, which is actually, for people who like Lacan and those things, it's very telling. He defines nature as what resists labor. And that's why you only learn about the natural world through labor, because, and labor very broadly defined, because what counts as nature is precisely that which resists having some other organization imposed onto it. And so there is this idea of the labor point of view, which is looking for that resistance. But later on, he develops the thing that we're actually reading, which is the organizational point of view, which is not exactly the same as that previous thing. So it's curious that in her work, she focuses on this idea of the labor point of view. She uses this to say that we should return to a more vulgar image of Marxism, of labor versus the world, labor versus capital, and that this image, which is kind of looks simplistic, but it's actually very sophisticated, is just not academic. That's her kind of her argument. I think it's actually quite a good argument, but she uses Bogdanov in that idea that there is sort of labor point of view, and it's slightly different, I think, from what is in this book. I think that this very early point, that this unity of the organizational point of view, and this first point here, it already kind of gives an idea of why we shouldn't really mix labor and organization or treat both as the same thing, you know? So I think that's one important point. But I definitely recommend her work as well. I think it's very useful as a starting point into like why this stuff is relevant.
Can you put the name of the book in the chat window?
Of course, just 1 second. I actually need to separate the chats just so I can actually comment on it. It's Molecular Red by Mackenzie Wark. So about 60 pages are dedicated to Bogdanov. Then there is this book called Beyond Math and Marx, I think. I forget the name of the author, and the biography is called Red Hamlet. There are some interesting papers as well. We even have them on, I don't know why this doesn't, anyway, there are some good papers on Bogdanov. There is a short one for people from Brazil. There is a short one in Portuguese that is quite good, and there is this guy who translated it, George Gorelick. He wrote a couple of texts. I think we have them on our PDF. I think this one here, which is not very well argued. It's a very short text. It's not like going into anything profound, but it's a kind of defense of why there's stuff in what he's doing, in the idea of tektology, which is neither in general systems theory nor in cybernetics. So he suggests that there is a sort of reduction of the project in the way that it was carried out, both in late Soviet engagement with systems theory and cybernetics, and in Western versions of these things. So it's nice that he gives this sort of defense that there is something worth looking, and that it's not just a matter of historical approach, you know, just look at what was done. But it's not very clear where the distinctions are. Like sometimes he says, well, Bogdanov pretty much was the first to consider the idea of an environment, not only of a system. Then there are some other precisions he makes about, because these are two concepts that he's supposedly the precursor of. The idea of feedback, because you have the idea of controllers and regulators in his project already, and the idea of environment, which you'll find later on in systems theory and ecological thinking, which you can also find in this book already. But I mean, it's what I think what Gorelick doesn't really focus on that much is I'm not sure if that's the big difference, but there is such a weird kind of it's such a strong point of view, in my opinion, concerning this idea that there are only organizational problems, right? And he accepts to treat such diverse things in terms of this specific perspective that I think it goes very much beyond what systems theory wants to consider, like is ready to consider as a system. So I don't know. It's hard to pinpoint exactly, but I think it's not just a matter of he thought this first, or that he attached these ideas of regulation, environment, and systems together very early on. But there does seem to be something slightly different, and I think that it also concerns politics. I mean, the political aspects of cybernetics and systems theory. I think it's not really in the forefront in any way, and I think that here it's connected to it. I mean, I'm not sure what you guys thought of this first chapter, but my impression is that, I mean, there is this very strong theoretical defense in the beginning of what is organization as a point of view and so on, but then it's a long kind of story about division of labor, specialization in knowledge, and how you need a new culture to both accept specialization and go beyond it, right? So the justification for a general theory of organization is not really scientific in the pure sense of this is the problem, we need to solve it, because from the very principles that he puts forward, that organization of production comes before, or conditions the organization of ideas, a very classic Marxist theme. There is no point in trying to solve something if there isn't, let's say, a real world kind of instantiation of that problem prior to it, right? Which for him is connected with the actual life, or the actual proletarian experience in Soviet Russia, right? I think it's perhaps worth mentioning before we begin, for people who didn't really take a look to his very crazy biography, that Bogdanov started, like he was a physician with specialization in psychology. Then he turned into Marxism still in the 19th century. Then he wrote what became the standard textbook for social democrat and Marxist political economy, like two books that were re-edited for, I don't know, 30, 40 years. So he was seen as a sort of big specialist on political economy, especially kind of a didactic teacher of Marxist political economy. Then between 1905 and 1915, so the years where the revolution was really on the sort of the forefront, besides a bunch of other texts he was writing, he started working on this kind of approach to organization and science, and a sort of critique of philosophy, which is also implied in this book. And is the thing that actually got him, ideologically, is the thing that got him to be at odds with Lenin, even though for a long time they had a truce, like they agreed to not talk about this. So even though they were pretty much the two main leaders of the Bolshevik party, this sort of divisions at the level of philosophy and so on, they really didn't come into play. until the moment where it seems like Bogdanov was gaining very high influence and he was kind of the leader of the more extreme left part of the Bolsheviks. And I think that it's very much connected with what he's proposing here, because I mean, I'm not sure if we're jumping too much, but I find this last paragraph here very telling of where he's coming from. It's the very end of this chapter, when he says, oh my God, where is it? He says that there are two things that jolt into the realization and shaping of the general organizational point of view, right? The World War, the First World War in the case, and the Soviet Revolution. And I find it interesting because he calls the World War the school of organization, right? So it's actually let's say the war taught people about the importance of this organizational point of view, but then the sort of great organizational crisis is connected with the revolution, which forced the working class to organize hastily and intensively, not only its own efforts, but to take over the organizational social life as a whole. And I like this because rather than calling the revolution a sort of solution to a problem, right, he calls it a crisis, in the sense that the revolution forced people to deal with problems of organization that they never had to deal with before. Rather than saying that finally we will put our ideas into play, the problem is actually that the revolution brought problems into view that they hadn't thought before. And I think that this is very important to understand his general position and the reason why this book was polemic and Lenin tried to bury it in a sense, because he had this idea of the proletariat, right? And a lot of time and energy in his life actually went into trying to experiment with this. But it was pretty much the idea that it's a sort of kind of theory of cultural revolution, right? That together with taking the means of production or bringing down the state or whatever, you had to develop sort of cultural situation in which certain problems could be positively formulated, and people could actually appropriate themselves from the situation, right? So you can see that he was a bit reactive, for example, in 1917 to the way that the constitution of the Soviets happened and the way that the government was established, because he was constantly saying that there was, I find it ambiguous because it's also a bit perhaps optimistic, like, oh, if we just create a culture, then things will have, like, people will deal better with the situation, or it will be more adequate for people to work through the new challenges. But at the same time, I think his pessimism concerning what would happen without such a proletarian culture, in a sense, was confirmed, because he never treated culture in terms of kind of awareness. Culture is for him very much, at least from what I understood thus far, this sort of space of how to transfer methods and where will you learn, where, if you can or cannot extract the means to learn how to do new things, right? And he very clearly says that there is a sort of new situation with industrial capitalism that creates this tension between specialization on the one hand, that's connected to the social division of labor, and on the other hand, the sort of universal or seemingly universal experience of the proletariat that is required to never be fully specialized in anything, to be kind of polymorphous in some sense. And he says, well, there is a sort of nascent cultural kind of a new culture of knowledge there that we need to develop if society is not gonna kind of ultimately resort to the same social technologies, right? So I think that culture should be understood probably in this sense, like what is available in terms of ways of kind of coming up with solutions or organizational experiments, so that, for example, you might resort to a new structure rather than just resort to a leader or to some very hierarchical system, not because you're manipulated or because it's ideologically overdetermined, but simply because we don't know how to do some things differently, right?
Yeah, on that topic, I thought it was interesting that he brought up technology as kind of a catalyst for this like reawakening of organizational science, because he mentions like the relationship of the laborer to the machine and how it starts off as the laborer is just kind of an appendage to the machine, it trying to, you know, maintain it. But then at some point, the laborer starts to organize the machines. And I think, although the text is pre-Turing, there seems to be that like a current there of like, once the machine becomes, the more general the machine becomes, the more different fields have to come together for the laborer in order to carry out tasks with the machine.
I thought this statement was very Turing-like.
Yeah.
An organizer of a universal type. Sounds like
exactly.
It can run any program, right?
Exactly, yeah. It seems to be a precursor to Turing.
Yeah,
and that makes sense. I mean, yeah, like teaching machines what to do. Like as machines become more complex, you need to be able to take ideas from different domains and implement them in a common language, a common kind of way of specifying these different laborers, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that this is, I mean, just before, I mean, I have a particular problem, especially I think I managed to anticipate some of the issues due to what we discussed last time, because of this universality that I think he suggests that the early 20th century proletariat would already achieve. I think the 20th century showed that it's not that easy, right? I mean, seems to be something to this. I mean, the little story, I mean, I do think we should cover in more detail the stuff, but the basic story that he covers in point 3, right, called The Path to the Organizational Science, he begins with a description of primitive and religious thought, and with this idea that there is a sort of basic metaphorical use of words that allow you to transfer, let's say, basic practical experience from one action onto other fields. And he tries to kind of account for the birth of religion basically from the spirit of commands, right? The idea of commanding somebody. And it's actually very interesting because he says it's because the organizer commands the organized, commands them to do something, bosses them around, that you then generalize this to the idea that things are caused in nature through the same principle. So therefore, there must be some commander behind causation, right? It's actually the whole chapter for me seems to be about the sort of lateral transfer of methods which he talks about a lot. So, for example, he will also talk about later on in this little story, he talks about popular tektology and how popular sayings have that structure of just giving you a sort of cause and consequence structure with no particular content, right? Like, I'm not sure if you have that expression in English, like, don't go in the rain if you don't want to get wet. No, it's not about rain and getting wet. It's just a sort of connection between cause and effect that applies to everything, right? So there is a lot of this sort of extension of our capacity to act that goes beyond the limit, for example, of social action, so people relating to people. From that sort of experience, you get structures that now we apply to people's relation to nature, for example, or to the description of nature's relation to itself. So there's a sort of transfer of the way we organize things, but there's also what he calls generalization, right? Because it's not like you can control this automatically. So usually these things get kind of out of hand and they're supposed to cover everything. And then there's the inverse movement of specialization, which is a sort of increased capacity for cognition and development of knowledge and so on. He talks about it by saying that it creates a greater economy of efforts because you learn how things are organized in specific restricted ways. But on the other hand, this also comes with a sort of big sort of equivocal problem at the level of language and science and philosophy, because you have many words or concepts to describe the same thing, then the same concept to describe very different things, and nothing matches anything. And it gets so complex that you can't really kind of bind it all together with a pre-modern worldview, right? So there's this weird kind of tension between generalization and specialization, right? Of learning how something works or engaging with something on its own terms, and then applying what you learn there to everything or to more things, right? And having to restrict or criticize your own deployment of these terms when they go too far and actually, rather than enlighten you about something, get in the way of you actually learning about it. And it seems like at the end of this whole story, right, we are at a sort of, it actually reads a lot like the Apolito mentions this text about scale thresholds and information thresholds. And there is something similar here, because the more specialization allows you to increase the specifications and the detailing of different fields of knowledge, the less it is possible to combine them all on one synthetic worldview, right? And so there seems to be a sort of shift, a sort of break between the period where philosophy was still something like natural philosophy. Philosophers encompassed and they studied all fields of knowledge, and there was like, every book had a bit of morals, a bit of natural physics, a bit of aesthetics and so on, and philosophy gave you a sort of systematized version of all of that. Then you get a sort of break in modernity where every domain of knowledge starts developing in radical autonomy and going to a greater detail, and this is kind of mirrored by the specialization in labor and so on. And he suggests that the sort of communist perspective in all of this needs to combine both, right? You can't go back to that sort of classic philosophical system, but you still need to ask, what does it mean to systematize this big mess, right? Because the sort of cultural correlate of the how do you call it, kind of overcoming of the division of labor will have to be an overcoming of the theory of knowledge that goes with the division of labor. But we know that it cannot be a return to a sort of one worldview system, because that doesn't make any sense. So I think that he stops, this chapter kind of stops there with a sort of, the time has come for this because of the proletariat, right? And because the conditions for seeing that there is something common to every different specialized labor is already here. But I think the 20th century actually proved that we didn't see the end of specialization, and we didn't see the end of the sort of disqualification of the laborer in front of machinery and other things, or the sort of actual imbrication between industrial capital organization of labor and the heterogeneity of social conditions, right? So I wonder if this kind of like Bogdanov looking at the way laborers are and workers are organized around certain jobs and tasks, and the sort of optimism that, well, once they start circulating in a society that, in a socialist society, it becomes clear that even though the material they're working on is different, and because of it being different, it structures both work and knowledge in different ways, still there is something common to all of these tasks and all of these fields, which is the fact that they're all organized in some way or another, right? So last time we were talking about this idea of social homogeneity as a sort of unthought presupposition of a lot of leftist political theory. And even though I think that he theorizes about this sort of conflict between organizational spaces and so on, I wonder if this conclusion about the terrain being, you know, a good moment for approaching this sort of universal perspective because of the needs of the times, if it was really, you know, so if it really was that possible. So that end there, I'm a bit skeptical about it. You know, when he talks about, well, the worker was appended, like it's just overviewing the machine. Therefore, he's looking at the way something is structured, kind of from the outside, almost like an observer from it. And he is at the same time capable of doing that for many machines, therefore for many different ways of transforming the world. So he's becoming this polymorphous subject. And yeah, that didn't happen, right? So I wonder what sort of change that must be made for this to be corrected or considered, that the 20th century didn't really show this sort of optimism concerning the instruction of a new culture just through the sort of circulation of labor and rotation of positions due to things like unemployment and things like this. They don't really make people more capable for some reason of systematization.
And the biggest gap in this first chapter, I think, is he doesn't address capital as a rival organizational science, right? Isn't capital also the thing that can cross all specializations and you know, like abstract labor is exactly that, right?
Yeah, but I don't think that he should put it as a. I mean, on this point, I think it's very similar to things we've been talking about, because I don't think that he does. I mean, to begin, this chapter is way too general to actually, I think, make use of that concept. But at the same time, he, for example, in this passage here, right? He says. Yeah, he gives us this tree. I wanted to talk about this, the word social norm, ideas and social norms. Then he says this thing here. Ultimately, I mean, this for me is the big kind of axiom behind this chapter. that the concept of organizing action is hidden in the term production, and he changes Engels' term from production of people, things, and ideas to organization of external forces, organization of human forces, and organization of experience, as a different way of saying the same thing. But then he says this here, right? That don't we also see everywhere destructive activities and disorganizing problems? Yes, but this is a particular instance of the same tendency. If society, classes, and groups collide destructively, disorganizing each other, they do so precisely because each collective aims at an organization of the world and of mankind for itself, according to its own ideals. This is the result of the separateness and isolation of organizational forces, the result of a lack of their unity and common harmonious organization. So it's a struggle of organizational forms. I think capital will appear inside here as just one of these things, right? I mean, in this sense, I think it's similar to our idea of how do you turn capitalism into something very large, but which is not everything? And how do you kind of turn the theory of organization into something that includes political economy, perhaps, instead of just saying organization is something totally different from economical structure. I think that's kind of what he's aiming at here, right? It's a bit weird and it's a bit corny, but I think that's kind of where it would go into, right? I think that it takes him a while to get into economy in this book, because I think he actually is treating something so much bigger, right? Like he wants the things he's talking about to apply to, I don't know, discussing a raindrop, discussing how workers get together, discussing how stars collide. I mean, he wants it to be very general. So, but I agree. I don't think he has the most sophisticated theory of capitalism, to be honest. Like,
yeah, it seems like our approach is to take this as like Bogdanov lays out why capital can organize things, because there's something already general underlying different forms of organization, right?
yeah,
And it's just a poor coordinating mechanism, but the fact that it can be coordinated it's something else. It's a different, there's already something, a precondition for capital here.
Yeah, and he does something very similar to Marx when he's talking about, let me just see if I can find it. In point 3, right, when he's giving this little history, he talks about, actually this page here, the guy he's quoting for this whole thing about the vagueness of primitive words. I mean, that's almost the title of Freud's text, The Antithetical Meaning of Primitive Words. And Freud was talking about a linguist called Karl Abel, and he's talking about, like, he was a guy who really influenced Bogdanov. It's called, what's the guy's name, for fuck's sake? This thing's not working. Yeah, I think it's called Ludwig Noiré. He had a very famous book on the origin of language that connected language, the emergence of language with work and actions, and I know from Bogdanov's biography that this was like one of his biggest influences ever. So it's kind of interesting to see him here debating this use of metaphors and language and so on. But when he gets to progressive division of labor with bourgeois ideology, right? He says, Yeah, the part of it that interests him is the division of labor, really, right? That's how I think how capitalism appears here. And he gives a sort of definition of its limits. He says, if we can find it.
Oh, I think the division of labor is, sorry, I'm not very good English, but I think the Bogdanov proposed a different definition about class, not only about labor.
I agree.
They think the difference between classes is who control the process of organization and not who have the property of the main production only.
Yeah, it's true.
They propose a different different vision about the class distinction, I think. And this, I think, interesting because these have another meaning about proletariat, because the proletariat have the people doesn't have control of the process of work, of the process of production, of the organization in this case. And I think this interesting about to thinking about how the capitalism works and how the proletariat fighting in the capitalism. And I think this is interesting because for this reason, this book is so complicated from Lenin and Stalin.
Yes.
Because the process of organization, I think, in Soviet Union is still split, still separado.
Yeah, split.
Still split, and then have to do the jobs and who control the organization thing. I think this is interesting.
Yeah, I really agree with you. At first, when I read it, I thought he was, how do you say it, too simple, because there's a lot of discussion in Marxism to say class is not a group of people, right? Class is a structure and so on. And then he says things like, well, there are different organizing views between classes, and it looks like it's reducing it to people fighting people, like a class war. But I think what you said is totally right. Like, it's actually even more abstract than just being a structural position, right? It's very broad because you can take over the means of production, you can actually own them, but not really have the means to develop a different way of organizing the things you own, right? So you can own them, but by a natural tendency, a spontaneous tendency, you will have to organize with the social technology that was available. So you can have to, I think this is something very important in his idea, in his studies, that because he treats the organization of things, of ideas, of experience as all being forms of organization, to the means of production in terms of technological means of production is just one of three means that you could take power of, right? You could take power of different ways of organizing ideas, different ways of organizing experience. And let's say you own technology, but the means of organizing people remain the same, even though some changes will happen by necessity because things are organized in new ways. You might have to resort to, let's say, the known ways of organizing people that we already have. So states, hierarchy, and things like this. So there is a sort of kind of triad that I think is a sort of the technological aspect of politics, right? The organization of things, the kind of proper political dimension of politics or the organization of people, and you have the sort of epistemological dimension of it, right? Which is also aesthetic and epistemological, which is the organization of experience. And apparently these three, class should have a meaning for these three things. It shouldn't have the meaning only of one, right? And it's not really the same as saying the real is economy and then these other things are the superstructure. That's not really how the metaphor is organized, right? It seems like they all have the same dignity. They're all realms of organizing. They're not totally separate, and one is totally conditioned on the other, even though he shows that one thing follows from the other, right?
Well, that's part of his point about the World War being a school of organization, right? When he says that they discovered through the war that the other two dimensions could supplement a lack in the third, and that they could be kind of moved around depending on the circumstance, and that one of them wasn't necessarily privileged if they could like problem solve with organizing people better and raising the spirit of the forces, then they could get around a technological lack. There wasn't this kind of like stacked hierarchy of, oh, we got to fix the technology in order to be able to resolve issues of people. And so that's part of, and that's a big difference, I think, between how, you know, Lenin and other Marxists saw the relationship between the war and the revolution, was that it was the revolution that you see as the school, and the war was just the crisis within which the revolution happened. For Bogdanov, the war actually opened up the ability to see this triad as being a kind of like interconnected and, you know, logically equal, I guess, even if they're different fields.
Yeah, he even says this, right? He says the three aspects, right? The organization of human forces, material means, and ideology. In practice, they appear as equals. At every step, each element can be substituted for the other, right? So, yeah, I think it totally backs up what you said. Like,
it's also interesting because when he takes the war as like a school of organization, if you kind of look backward on revolutions up to the Russian Revolution, most of the revolutions had a war that preceded them, whether it was the French Revolution or the Paris Commune, so that there seems to be like a much tighter logical connection between these massive conflicts and revolutionary changes, as opposed to the kind of idea you get of the war is just a kind of backdrop and condition for the rising consciousness of a revolution. There's something in the linkage between those two that is educational and that really shows the importance of education, which is what a lot of like military historians argue, that modern warfare is what brought logistics up, made logistics into its own science, and then that passed over into capitalism as a science to be practiced.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that this makes a lot of sense, especially because from the sort of big Marxists of early Soviet thinking, I think Bogdanov was the one that was most engaged in the war. Like, he was actually a doctor in a war front, and he says in his biography, in his autobiography, that it was one of the most important experiences for him. So there is a very good chance that the strength with which he engages with this idea of organization is very much like a consequence of him being schooled through the war, you know, and not simply, let's say, because I totally agree with you. It's a difference of saying the war teaches something about this new approach to things than talking about the war as a sort of good conjuncture, right? It's an opportune moment to do what we already know. It's different from saying the war showed that there is this other perspective on things, right?
In those things you've read about his kind of history, Gabriel, is there anything, does he engage with Lenin's argument to bring in Taylorism and scientific management? Because it seems like there would be a a debate there, because Lenin just kind of imports bourgeois organizational methods, and they bring back a lot of the old managers and stuff, and seem to kind of like, you know, at the level of actual organizational theory, just bring back what was already in place or try to update it with what America and Germany are doing.
Yeah, there is a mention to that, and I think that I know Renzo read this book by this guy called Robert Linhart, who studies Lenin's texts from this is his name. It's called Lenin, Taylor, and the Peasants. I think it's with a T. And I just to connect with what you said, I think that it's interesting because it's not like Bogdanov takes the sides of the peasants while Lenin takes the sides of the industrial workers, but there is something to that. I think Bogdanov is kind of like a Maoist avant la lettre in the idea that, like, if you define Maoism with this kind of revolution inside the revolution, right? You take power, but then you need to revolutionize the party because the bureaucratic culture of communists themselves is out of date with its own, with the very forces it unleashes in China, right? There is something similar that I do think that puts him closer to the side of peasant culture than Lenin. Like, I think what this Linhart guy shows very nicely is that there is a total change in perspective in Lenin in like 6 months. In February, like January 1917, Lenin is one of the few people who realizes that the time of the crops in Russia, which was October, is going to create a point of decision. Like, the peasants will have to decide, will they give the crops to the landowners or will they keep the crops? So that's like a concrete moment based on material necessity where a decision concerning who owns the crops will have to be made. And like, that's when the Bolshevik Party actually changes its line, right? It was against the sort of moving the focus from the cities to the fields, but they actually decide to back that decision, to kind of support the decision of the peasants to keep the crops. But then very quickly, in 6 months, a whole new problem emerges because people were starving in the fields. Now that they have their crops, they don't want to again give it away to the city because it's already not a large crop. The situation was already very bad. There was a lot of hunger. So they hide from the provisory government the crops, right? And Lenin and the party, they send to the fields people to learn where are the crops going since they're not being distributed and shared with the city. And when he sees that there is a sort of resistance from the peasants to enter into a new regime of distribution, right? So the first movement, the decision was, do you give it to others or do you keep it to yourself? But in the second moment, the decision changes and it becomes, do you give it to the landowners or do you give it to the Socialist Party, right? Do you still distribute it socially? And the peasants kind of become reactive. And then Linhart shows that there was no solution at the table available for Lenin other than say, we need a military kind of intervention that to organize distribution of resources by force from the fields to the city, right? And then his argument is that this is connected to his trust in Taylor, because the idea in Taylorism, because the idea was this thing that looks like a sort of violent imposition on the peasants, because labor is a universal thing, because the division of labor into minutes, hours, and it's a sort of universal form, what now looks like a separatist or conflictive move, once this is applied, will be the basis for a unification of the field and the city, right? The sort of necessary imposition that looks like a sacrifice, but once peasants themselves start to be more like city workers, there will be a kind of some homogeneity produced. And for Linhart, like Lenin should be credited with the military organization of labor in the fields, not Stalin, because even though he applied it in his lifetime to the distribution of goods, I mean, it's just, if you just take that thinking to its natural conclusion, why just distribute goods in this way? Why not just produce them in that way already? So there is a kind of a conflict, a concrete conflict, like not a philosophical problem, right? How the hell do you solve this issue with the tension between city and the fields and the peasants and the workers, right? This internal contradiction that every socialist project has to deal with. And then there is a trust in Taylor. Like Taylor is not, let's say, a philosophical stake. It's a totally organized, like political organizational problem, and he offers a solution. Like if we homogenize the means of looking at the field and the city by looking at both through this sort of strongly organized, disciplined form of production, we will also produce social homogeneity that will kind of undo the tension, right? And I think that if you look at Bogdanov's position, like he has a critique of, I know of a text where he critiques Lenin, but he's usually very, it's funny, he thinks Lenin is a moron in philosophy, but he clearly admires the guy as a political tactician and strategist. Like he doesn't take easy, doesn't take easy punches. Like, so I don't know of anything where he simply says, oh, the guy is a monster. Because if you were honest person living there, probably it was hard to think of anything else. But it's interesting just to see what he did, right? After the Russian Revolution, he leaves, he's actually expelled from the party, but he doesn't try to stay there. And he goes to create this sort of schools for proletarian culture, right? This movement, prolecult, which is not, they're not urban, like it's not in Petrograd, Leningrad or whatever. They're schools in outer places. It seems that he thought that you couldn't just bring more formal labor to solve this issue, right? Which seems very fitting with this. And he does seem to have a more, in my opinion, he thinks that peasants think. Like, you know, this whole point about primitive religious, then popular tektology, you can see he's not, this is the same thing as science. It's just applied to a different size of the world, right? If you're living with a certain degree of complexity and stuff, yeah, popular sayings are ways of transferring methods or whatever, right? So I think that he has a much more, he probably would be, I'm not sure if in the context he would act differently, but he surely had a bit more of a charitable perspective towards the supposedly more reactionary part of the Russian people, you know? So I'm not sure what would come out of that that's different, but I do think that there is something to it that is different and that connects to the problem of Taylorism as a sort of, not only as a theory of Taylorism, not only as a sort of wager on how to bet on economic development, but also as a way to solve social conflict, which I think this book by Linhart really shows that Lenin also had that in mind, you know, perhaps even before anything else. It's really amazing, this book. I'm not sure if it's in English, but I really recommend it.
Yeah, it's a really, really great book. I mean, that example of that Bogdanov gives on the war, I think is really illuminating, like on the way, like with limitation of technical development, which are like limitations on organization of things, you cannot try to fill in the problem with organizing people, like putting more people in the front lines, but you can also use like organization of ideas. You can just like mobilize through like ideology. So he looks at it as not some kind of, he looks at different like technological solutions for the same problem. And in a way, like in this Linhart book, it seems that you can like get different problems pertaining to coming from different like aspects being experienced or things. For example, the problem you were saying about the peasants, how you distribute the food that they put to the city. It in a sense it boiled down to like a kind of like ideological problem that the peasant wouldn't understand that it made sense for them to give up the food. So in a sense, given this kind of like ideological problem, Lenin had first before the revolution, he defended a more like a different kind of organizational solution for work in the farms. But given this problem, he kind of he uses militarization to solve that, and he kind of like dislocates the kind of like emancipatory principle from work, from things, to people, like from the state apparatus being the place where the revolution was happening, and not anymore like production. And you could like I think you could do this kind of analysis of how you, once you get to limitations in one kind of organization, you can then displace it into, like, for example, you could then say that in Stalinism, what was left of the revolution was not the state, was only the ideology in terms of an organizational principle that was kind of like filling up for the lack of success in the other domains. And but if you turn that around and say that if it's actually relevant the way you organize all these three aspects, then the state organizing the production is constituting a different point of view than organizational point of view than the workers taking on production, because although they functionally they are doing the same function, like you're making property collective in some way, the mediation, the way you implement that is one through centralization in the state power and the other through like self-organizing. You're giving rise to really completely different like organizational point of views.
Yeah, for example, one thing that I remember we spoke about this this example that I really like. I think now that you said this, it actually could be an example of why we need to talk about three different kind of ways of taking the means of organizing something. Because remember that example that Norbert Wiener, he was invited to go to Detroit to automate the first automobile factory. And he went there and he saw what would happen, right? Most workers would lose their jobs. And he refused to do it. And he wrote a letter to the head of the trade union in Detroit of automobiles. So like the largest automobile trade union, the largest workers union, I think in America at the time, it was like the 50s, right? And he said, look, I was just invited to automate your factory. I declined, but someone else will do it. You guys need to run and find a way to exert power in that domain. Like, I don't know, buy patent, intellectual property, something. And the letter from the trade union back to him is like the most tragic thing, because it's like, you don't know where the struggle is. You don't know what is important. You think that it's technology and science, but that's like idealistic stuff. Work is what makes the world go round and things like this. And leave it to us. We know what we're doing. No, we're like the most powerful trade union ever. So fuck off. What do you know? And then Detroit collapses, right, in the next 30 years and becomes this sort of emblem of the decadence of industrial America, right? And like, what is missing? Like, what is the miscommunication between two people in that situation? It does seem like it's a sort of clearly Norbert Wiener had very little contact with the actual workers' movement. He thought a letter, people would just say, thank you so much, Norbert Wiener, for your letter. Now we're going to change everything. But probably if he was a bit more intimate with the workers' movement, he would know that there is a sensibility that goes together. Like there's an organization of experience that goes together with the organization of means of production. And I think that if only there was a different way of experiencing what it means to be working, right? Because most of the industrial experience of work has to do, and Marx says this very nicely in a very ambiguous passage on the chapter on manufacture, and then the chapter on machines in Capital, that machines kind of, because machines are preceded, right? Before you implement machines in factories, you actually make people work in a more machine-like way. So social relations between people in a way that they're treated as cogs or treated as parts of a collective system appeared before machinery. Like in manufacturers, you already had that. And it's because people were organized in that way that then machines could substitute them. Because first you need to turn actions into, let's say, things that are describable by a command, right? So before you can have a machine that ties together a bunch of actions and gets some output, you need to be able to distinguish the work process in a way that it's made of those actions, right? So before you need workers to be a bit like machines, and no wonder that Babbage, the guy who developed like some of the first intuitions on computers, he actually wrote the first books on very modern organization of work. But then Marx says, when you organize in this way and machines embody social relations in this way, the tendency is for workers to see machines as the very embodiment of alienation, right? So I'm now an appendage and machines are at the center, and then there's a struggle, who is more important, right? Me and my knowledge or the machine. So there is a tendency for this struggle to happen between you and the machinery. The idea that you should be able to look at the machinery as being your, let's say, both taking your place and at the same time being yours, it's a very weird way of organizing how you describe work. So I wonder if this isn't a good way of talking about the sort of shortcomings of not having this sort of organization of experience as a concern as well, because you can't really convince people to buy intellectual property or to get into the design of a factory, and make that the trade union's problem without making that the business of workers, right? One thing is to say, I own the factory because I don't want to be submitted to it anymore. Another thing that is very different is saying, I own, like, it's also my problem how I submit to the factory. Like, I need to actually sit down with people and think how it should be automated, for example. Seems like a slightly different issue then. It's not a property issue, right? It's a, I don't know, science issue or something. So I don't know, I find that kind of miscommunication between Norbert Wiener and the trade union guy. I really wish I could find the letters. I think they're easy to find online.
Gabriel, just one thing. This passage that you were talking about, from manufacture to the great industry, don't you think that when Bogdanov talks about the idea as a tool, as the second tool, he talks about three kinds of ideas, and the passage from the technical idea to the idea of science is something like this passage that you just mentioned, from manufacture to industry. I don't know if
it makes sense to me, but I don't think it's like Marx doesn't seem to. It's very ambiguous the way that these chapters in Capital are very strange. I think from cooperation, like the whole description of actual organization in Capital So the chapters that describe how people actually do things in production, they're all within the section on relative surplus value, right? So corporation, manufacture, industry, work, housework, and modern manufacture, like the whole description of how people combine their labor, everything is done under relative surplus. So it's weird because on the one hand, Marx is talking about the power of organizing. Look at how people doing things differently can do much more. So there is a kind of a slightly poetic tone, and kind of sometimes he seems very admiring it. And then he says, but you know what the outcome is? People get hungrier, weaker, and like things go to hell. But it's very weird, right? How it's those chapters. And I think that that with this idea that Bogdanov presents, it becomes clearer for me. Like this, I only understood this part about manufacture and industry after I read a bit of Bogdanov, because it should be striking when we read usual descriptions of technology, history of even in Marxism. The intuition is that it should be the opposite, right? First, we introduce machines, which are material and objective, and then people become more like machines. That's like our kind of cultural studies today describe things like the more you're attached to machines, the more you become like machines. But in Capital, the connection is the inverse. Like first, you start with cooperation, and then you see that cooperation is way too powerful, because cooperation doesn't really connect people. It can connect actions between people without connecting the people. Therefore, you can connect people in weird ways. You can kind of split people into parts and connect the parts of people and not really connect human beings. So it's a very strange domain. And then it says that it's because cooperation is so plastic that it can allow capital to organize laborers as if they're just partial parts of a process, and the whole process is only seen by the collective. And only after this, only after you change the part and whole relation, then machines appear, right? So, and in fact, in historical sense, it actually makes sense, because Babbage was first writing on political economy and then writing on computers and the sort of basic structure of concatenating actions in the way of fully describing some process, right? So it's strange, because isn't that idealist? Like, isn't that the bad history? The history of subjectivity first and then objectivity. Of first people relate and there is some abstract thing, and then you have machines, right? But I think that, and to go to a topic that we debated already, Raquel, it's very much exactly like the value form, because first you have some social relation, for example, the relation of value, and then you find something material that embodies the social relation, right? So it's not that gold is value, right? Is the form of value. But because the form of value has some structure, gold was a good material to embody it, right? Or salt, or silver, or whatever. So strangely enough, it's the social relation that is concrete, and the material, which is the abstract embodiment of something concrete, right? And something similar happens with machines. The concrete part is that people connect in the production as if they're parts of a whole, and the whole is the sum of their parts. And then machines embody that relation. It's not the inverse. And I find it very counterintuitive at first, but I only felt okay with that idea once I was convinced by the idea that well, why is the organization of people less material than the organization of parts in a machine, right? But there is some strange intuition there.
You also have this kind of transitionary point between manufacturing and machines where Marx talks about that the early machines were directly modeled on what the manufacturers were doing with their hands and their tools.
Yeah.
But then as engineering technologists kind of got momentum and started experimenting, the machines became more and more inhuman because they're becoming more efficient to do their whatever function. And you see something similar in the first couple decades of personal computers and microprocessors, where at first computers were just used to replace what people were doing by hand or with typewriters and calculators. They were just used for word processing, accounting, calculations. But as they developed, you get into the place where you realize that you can actually open up new ways of organizing data, organizing algorithms, and they begin to take a life of their own. But you have to have this step where first they kind of mirror what humans were doing with tools before they can kind of fully get their own autonomy. And then you kind of actually see what the machines can do. And I think part of what Marx shows in that passage is that people don't really understand the potentials of machines. They have to first go through this mimetic phase where they're mirroring people. And then you see, oh, wow, like we could actually take this to the nth degree and really kind of unleash new potentials.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. But I think that I think it's the two-part argument, right? In the same way that there is no teleology. The moment that gold becomes the embodiment of value, well, gold has its properties and new things are possible that weren't possible just with, let's say, a money commodity that was shifting. Once it's established as gold, a lot of things happen, which are not prescribed by necessity. They happen because that material embodiment happened. And I think the same thing goes for machines, right? It's true in some sense that they're they're embodying a structure that was there before. You wouldn't, and I mean, this is important actually, because Marx's argument about automation and machinery depends on this. He says, nobody's gonna use automation or machinery as long as employing people is cheaper. So there is no teleology of automation. It's necessary for capitalism. Whereas cheaper to employ miserable people, it will always prefer to employ miserable people because it's cheaper. So you get the clear sense that machines are embodying something that was already there before in a sort of relational way. But the ones that they embody that, you can, God knows what you can do, right? It's not just there to be the embodiment. So it's still free to become some other thing. But I think that this argument that we're discussing, it connects very nicely to the beginning of the text, something that I found was a bit, I'm not sure if I'm reading too much into it. I'm not sure what you guys think, but like this beginning, right? He says this thing with very old-fashioned, the description that the struggle of mankind, in its aim is the dominion over nature, and that dominion is relationship of organizer to organized, that this is the meaning and content of the age-long labor of mankind. I do like in this first passage that, and I think Mackenzie's work shows this very nicely, that the way that Bogdanov suggests that class struggle will end is that he says this somewhere else that in a very nicer way. It's like class struggle is a sort of repression of the struggle between man and nature. So rather than struggling with nature as mankind, you divide mankind into a part of mankind that doesn't struggle with nature and a part that does. The part that does is called the working class. And it feels the resistance of nature, and which is what we call the forces of production, and then it connects with the other classes in terms of the relations of production. And rather than having a sort of harmonic view of what happens when you end class struggle, you actually democratize the struggle with nature everywhere, right? So the end of class struggle wouldn't be the overcoming of struggle, would be just a sort of moving the discontent in civilization to the discontent in nature, right? Something doesn't fit. We need a lot. There are no solutions. We don't know what to do. There's a meteor. There is scarcity. There is ecological problems. Like those things still be around. So, for example, when you read Bogdanov's Utopia, right, his first sci-fi book, The Red Planet, and then the other one called The Engineer Mary, I don't remember, The Engineer Many, they're not books about like everything is good in an utopia. They're like the kind of adventure books about things going wrong. You know, like you need to build a bridge or a tunnel and the terrain doesn't allow you to, oh my God, we have not enough wealth to do this thing, but we need to do it. But then what shifts is who struggles with nature. It just becomes a global problem, right? So it's an adventure for everyone. It's not just a problem for a few without proper resources. So even though this passage looks a bit kind of like classic Marxism of humanity is the animal that dominates nature, nature is our bitch, and let's just rule over everything. If you look at like the Bogdanov's general work, you can see that when he talks about the age-long labor of mankind, it's very much in a sort of enthusiastic way. Like people were made to struggle with the things they're made of. That's, let's say, the good life, to be perpetually afraid of nature rather than to be perpetually afraid of each other. I think that's kind of like how he begins. It's not very clear here, but I think it's very clear in other of his books. But the thing I wanted to pay attention to is that, so he talks about nature resisting, right? And we need to organize to counter this sort of resistance of nature. The unit of this sort of survival problem is the working collective. But then he says this thing where he distinguishes tools, right? He says, if we only organize nature with the forces and means given to us by it, we wouldn't have any advantage over the other living creatures, which also fight for survival. In its labor, mankind uses tools, which it takes from the external nature. So that's the first definition, like a connection between mankind organization of nature through tools. But then he says something else, which I think this is the main paragraph, right? He says, the more difficult than organizing external nature, right? An even more difficult problem for mankind is to individually and collectively organize itself. In the complexity of human organism and society, blind and conflicting elemental forces are hidden, at times as terrible and destructive as the forces of nature. So the most destructive and monstrous explosion of these forces are actually human nature and not external nature, right? This whole paragraph is talking about something that is internal to humanity, not external, right? So its self-organization of mankind is a struggle with its own internal biological and social primordial forces. For this, mankind needs tools just as much as for the struggle with external nature, although different tools, namely instruments of organization. So it's interesting that you actually have a division between tools for external transformation, right? And tools for internal transformation. And tools like a hammer, they are adequate for external transformation, but he puts on the same level, or even with more difficult, so even a higher level of problem, developing what he calls instruments for organization. And I think that what we were talking about, machinery and manufacture, you have that sort of thing. You would put manufacture here. The manufactured form is a way of organizing the biological and social forces of humankind, right? Dividing people in the production process and so on. And then this becomes a way of transforming external nature. So there is this sort of idea that an internal transformation precedes an external transformation. It's all through this book. And I think that the reason why I'm mentioning this is that it goes very well with what we were talking about last time when I mentioned that the project I'm involved with Paraná concerns applying stuff to the organization of the left before you apply it to the outside. So I think it has a similar intuition, you know, and but I think that this principle, that this comes in somehow epistemologically, this comes first, and then you get this, right? First, you invent new ideas on how to organize life, which still is material and still concerns survival. But once you do this, you tend to reinvent the way that you organize external nature. So I think that this seems justified in Bogdanov's view, because once he moves, I mean, he then gives this sort of three instruments of organization or three vehicles, right? The word, ideas, and social norms. And he says that these are ways of organizing experience. But once he defines all of this and he goes into the way we organize things, I think that there are actually two movements, right? Because I wouldn't know how to schematize this, but there seems to be in this part too, right? The idea that nature, it does things to itself in terms of, he talks about insects, patriarchy in insect colonies and things like this. And because we are also part of nature, so man also organizes in similar ways, right? So that seems to be a first movement where nature comes first. Let's say natural external reality comes first, and our way of doing things comes second. But then in the third part of the book, of the chapter, when he's talking about religion and popular tektology and so on, it seems like it's the inverse. The way that man relates to themselves precedes the way that we then relate to nature. So it's a bit of a weird kind of connection, right?
Gabriel, I had a question. I think you answered part of it, but like in the beginning part, I didn't get to read the entire essay, but the beginning part, I cannot shed the feeling that the language he's using is a little bit teleological. I mean, he opens up by saying that there is an aim to the struggle between human and nature, and that basically, especially with the comparison he makes between the tendency to organize among humans and the natural tendency for organization, which he calls elemental organization, basically points to a common theme between nature and man, and that is the tendency to survival. Mm-hmm. So organization is both a vehicle, it seems, both in nature and man as part of the nature in order to survive. Mm-hmm. Is that a general characterization of what he sees organization in this section?
Yeah, I kind of think there is like this idea. I mean, he talks about this aim, which is dominion, but then he also says that he doesn't make this the thing that defines humanity, right? He says, in the struggle of mankind with aim elements, its aim is the dominion over nature. Like it's different than saying that mankind's place is to dominate nature, I think. Because then he says that other living creatures also fight for survival against the rest of nature, right?
Mhm.
So it does seem to put us in the same category insofar as everyone is just trying to stay alive.
And especially like dominion over nature is not an ethical comport. It is like a survival is a very materialistic thing. It's not like
I think so too.
we are created in order to have to basically answer our essential kind of like the Heideggerian call for truth or something. It's just like the rest of the domain of nature. We are creatures of nature, and we survive. We struggle for survival.
Yeah.
And nature basically creates pathways in order for this struggle to go through evolution, and humans basically learn these pathways and then imitate this organization, but in ways that is particular to humans, like for example through words, ideas, and social norms.
Yeah, I agree with you. He has this idea that it's tools that provide mankind with a growing superiority over the strongest and terrible giants of elemental life, distinguishing us from the rest of the nature's kingdom. So there is this sort of, that's where I mean, if you guys remember one of the last meetings we had, we made this distinction, right? Between, just had this here, there was this little drawing I made of, Dennis and I were using it, right? Where you have, we can put it nature here, why not? Nature and from nature, all the parts of the production process come, right? So the material.
I don't see anything, or I don't see anything on the.
Sorry, just one
me
second.
neither.
Yeah, I'm just trying to see if it works.
Okay. Yeah.
So the material, then nature also provides the tools. They're made of material stuff. It provides the land. And then we said, yeah, that there is something weird, which is nature makes man, and in some sense, it makes the limits of man's efforts. So our efforts are somehow limited by nature, but the design that, let me just change the color here. The design that goes into organizing effort, tools, land, and material, right, into some final product. This design is actually not fully determined by nature. And there is this distinction we use between saying that the land, the material, the tools, and the effort are subjected to natural laws, right? But the design is actually based not on what needs to be, but on rules. So we made the distinction between natural laws and rules. And he kind of does that when he talks about words, ideas, and social norms as a sort of unique instruments of organization, right? And then we said, okay, so a big task for Marxism is to explain the meaning of this arrow. Why is man's determination of nature distinct from a natural law? So that this design is not fully determined by the things it is connecting, right? And I think that this is something nice to have in mind so we can ask of the book as we're reading it, because as we were saying last time, right? Just gonna make this a bit clearer. So if you have, let's say, nature, these things are kind of under natural laws. and somehow you have this sort of menace here, and there is something Marx calls the design that defines how you turn this into something else. So the product, the end product, has one property, which is that it would never have appeared spontaneously, right? Natural laws seem to be somehow connected with the idea of spontaneous change or a tendency. But somehow we can organize things so that they happen against a regular tendency. Well, the name people usually give, for example, in physics, for taking a system out of its natural tendency against its natural tendency is work. And then we have this to explain, okay, how can it be that we can put things to work against their natural tendency, right? And we know some answers. The first answer is that we are absolutely different. So work, capacity for labor, not even work in the physics sense, but capacity for labor makes us different from everything in nature by essence. The second answer is total indifference, the idea that there is nothing special, right? Absolutely no distinction, so indistinct. Which is to say, you can either say, well, but there's actually a natural law to how people do things. Social norms, ideas, and words, they're actually ultimately defined by natural laws. Society is organized because it's naturally for it to be organized in this way. Or you can have the more leftist ecologic idea that it's not that man is like everything else, but everything else is just like man, right? So all animals also labor. Nothing is spontaneous. Everything in some sense is kind of like you can treat every species as being bound by rules and not by biological tendencies or something. And then there is this third thing we were trying to explore that I think is kind of like where Bogdanov comes in. Because the distinction will be real, right? But it's not a matter of essence, as it's the case here. But it's something else, right? It's because these are all, like there is some sort of similarity, because for him, these are all forms of organization. These are also forms of organization. So there is some common terrain before there is some difference, right? So it's, so here, if here is the common version, and here is the difference version. Here with Badiou, we have something like common, where we are like nature, but we are also different. And the issue is how to bind these two things together, right? And I think
that's where,
yeah.
Well, isn't that part of where, like, especially going back to the earlier point you're making about, you know, things seem to kind of start coming from nature, but then there's this shift where they come from humanity. That's in part the development of specialization, right? Because he begins by comparing specialization in humans with specialization in ant colonies and termites and whatnot. But as it develops, it actually shifts the way that humans see nature, and it moves away from that earlier kind of classic natural philosophy and monism to where it stops being a kind of natural, spontaneous way of dividing human beings up and takes on something that is separate to a certain degree.
Yeah, I think that this, I agree with you that this connects to this issue. This sort of, I would call that the theme, and I'm really interested in this. I would put it in this terms. It's called surrogate. Just write it. Surrogate reasoning. Surrogate reasoning is a field today that studies the way that we can displace, in Portuguese is raciocínio delegado, like delegado para alguém, né? The idea is that you, for example, you have some problem in your mind. You can instantiate it in some material thing, and then the material thing works with itself in a way that you couldn't solve it in your head, right? So they're studying, for example, why certain supports help you solve problems that you cannot solve without the support. And it's not simply, for example, because it stores memory better than you. For example, I want to remember how to go to my grandmother's house. If I actually draw a map, right, with the streets, and I do this, and then I get there, okay, I can have information about all of these houses and their relations all kept together in the map. I can have more information in the map than I could have in my head, right? But they try to go further with this, and their point is that there is something called a freeloader determination, which is the idea that once you instantiate a problem on a material support, the material support might have means to do more than the problem you wanted to solve, right? So when I drew my map, I only wanted to go to my grandmother's house. All I needed to know is that there is this street here and she lives here. But the same map that makes it easy for me to say this also contains information about, you know, the other side of the street, about the distance between me and her. So material supports for solving problems also pose new problems that you didn't think of, right? I think that that's one of the ways of tackling what you said, John, about, you know, you might even instantiate some structure on a machine and you solve the problem of organizing some tasks. But the machine doesn't only contain information about that problem. Once you set up a machine, you can see other things you couldn't see in the initial problem, right? So there's a sort of means and ends transformation. So I think that this connects to that already. I hopefully in the future, I'll try to do something on presentation on surrogate reasoning, because I think we can do the same thing for organizations. Like that idea we were talking about, how complex organizations might grasp better social complexity. I think it's a case of this. I might not be able to think how complex a social space is, but I might be part of an organization that can actually work through that problem, reason with social complexity better than I can. It's a bit of extended mind, David Chalmers thing, but hopefully less Megadeth. Like I always look at him, I think he sings in a 80s rock band. But I think that there is also something that in this chapter already appears, which is, you know, I think that especially in this second part where he's talking about the activity of nature, right? He's saying that after he spoke about instruments of organization and how politics can be put inside the field of struggle of organizational forms, right? He starts talking about nature, and there is this sort of the same idea of common but different, right? Is constantly at play. Like he talks about, actually he will go back to it many times, but this sort of mimesis, right? Here he says it better. So the possibility of imitation, right, is sufficient proof that between the elemental organization work of nature and the consciously planned work of man, there is in principle no impassable difference. Like this is a statement that if we go back to that little drawing, right, you can see that it is a statement about how to answer to this question here. Right, there is a sort of gradient between how different we are from nature, from the rest of nature, right? So mimesis the fact imitating nature, or imitating the rest of nature. Then he says in the next paragraph about parallelism, right? So there it's actually a kind of mimesis. He suggests that we both purposefully imitate, right? And that we reproduce. So animals have fur. We create clothing that furs us. So there is some sort of imitation. But then he said there's also a sort of parallelism, because things that could never be seen to be the same. So people could never have looked at ants or insects and copy insects because we didn't have means to understand, but we actually do similar things, right? So there's already, I mean, there seems to be, rather than a sort of philosophical indistinction, we are just in nature, guys. Forget about difference between humans and nature. Humans are in nature, culture is nature, and so on, or this sort of absolute difference. Humans are absolutely out of nature. Any attempts to think about humans as part of nature implies some fantasy or letting go of something important. With him, you get something like a gradation, right? There are many ways in which we are similar or different. You can become more different, you can become more similar. There is some leeway, some space, right? And
yeah, on a naive level, natural selection or whatever, the evolution is a form of specialization. And
yeah.
the problem is it cannot be surmounted with nature alone. Nature creates specialized life forms, but those life forms can't like jump out of their environment and cross forms, unless the environment changes drastically, right? So there's something about design or this surrogate reasoning or language in general. It's somehow able to accumulate things from different fields of specialization to the point where they get mixed up together. And that mixing, I think, is also something that nature lacks.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I also think that, actually, you said this now, I think that this is a really important thing about Bogdanov, from what I understood thus far, is that, for example, another way of talking, there are two ways also of talking about language according to those two other positions of absolute difference and absolute commonality, which I think is, there are many languages in nature. Languages, let's say, dolphins have language, bees have language. Language is this sort of symbolic dimension that, who said that other animals are not speaking? Like, you cannot know. And there is the other version, which is language separates humans from the rest of the natural world. And I find that Bogdanov also has a very interesting position, because in that part 3, where he's talking about the path to the organizational science, and then religious thinking, then early modern, or whatever you want to call it, sort of generalization of sciences. There is this idea that language is both a good thing and also a troubling thing. Like, language helps you to transfer things through metaphors, but language cannot prevent you from using this wrong, right? So the idea that there is one language for everything makes you think, but makes you act in a very anthropomorphized way. Like, science could never develop if we were stuck to generalizing things through language, because the problem is that you need to generalize and then restrict back, right? So you first learn, like, you first realize in this internal way that there is an instrument of organization, which is some people coordinate action and some people execute the action, right? Some people organize, some people are organized. And you can do more things by doing in that way. If everyone had to individually coordinate their actions to build a pyramid, it wouldn't be built. To build a building, it wouldn't be built, right? Things like this. So you need, like, somebody to act like a synthesis and the other to act like hands. But if you generalize this for everything, so this is a new way of organizing material, to think of it in those terms. And you might be able to develop a theory of cause in this way. You can talk about law, right? Natural law is a metaphor where it seems like things are obeying a command, right? If you look at when people started describing, I mean, Spinoza criticizes this, right? The sort of anthropomorphic idea of God, because if nature has laws, somebody must have created the laws. Like there is a weird, like every time you generalize a method of organization, you carry something from the field you generalize it from that doesn't apply to other fields, right? So true, I can distinguish between cause and effect, I can distinguish better using this social relation, but now it says too much. It says that there is a commander and things that are commanded, and that doesn't apply. So if you just trust language to generalize, it actually hinders development of cognition. It doesn't necessarily increase the size of the world. So there is a constant move between those two things, right? Generalization and then specialization. And it seems like you can have problems on both sides. So it doesn't seem like you could simply put the responsibility for human difference on the side of language, because if that was the case, we might have gotten stuck in other moments, right? Or you wouldn't necessarily. There are moments where this would hinder development. So I think that it is interesting that he puts words, and he then talks about like special words for action and things like this at a lower degree of capacity for social organization, right? It does allow you to transfer things. So you develop one word that applies to many situations. That's, let's say, the basic idea of transferring between situations, right? But this can go too far. So complexes of ideas already singularize things more, because if you have many ideas connected together, they will apply only where all the things connect, not only when you recognize the same thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if here when we talk about language, we include mathematics, because, or even like the language developed by science in the pursuing a particular, understanding of things, right? You can invent more precise language that isn't anthropomorphic, but it takes something that's not takes a different kind of impulse, I guess, to invent that language.
Yeah,
because I think it comes into the process of moving from analyzing or the study of cutting up plots of land in agriculture towards geometry and astronomy and whatnot. Like the specialization that he talks about there with geometry and astronomy doesn't run into the same problems that he talks about with words passing in between.
I think that he actually says that because in the next chapter, he's going to distinguish between three types of organization. Organizations where the sum of parts is equal to the whole, organizations where the sum of parts is larger, the whole is larger than the sum of parts, and organizations where the whole is smaller than the sum of parts. And he says that mathematics is a tektology for systems where the whole is equal to the sum of parts. This makes sense because the mathematics in his time was pretty much at that level. That, I mean, especially the stuff we've been discussing today deals very nicely with stuff where there is generative effects. You don't need to be non-mathematical to talk about wholes that are larger than the sum of the parts. But he doesn't put mathematics together with natural language. And I think that this is actually a very nice way to understand. I was trying to find the quote here. here, for example, he's talking about the correlation in kinship between mathematics and tektology. The laws of mathematics do not refer to this or that field of the phenomena of nature, but to all and any phenomena, and only from the point of view of their magnitude. So he's still also very much talking about mathematics as the science of magnitudes, which is how Hegel described mathematics. And I mean, it's something that actually already in Bogdanov's time wasn't really true. But he goes very much, so here he will define mathematics as a tektology of neutral complexes. So pretty much of structures where the whole of the system is given by the propositional parts that compose it, right? You learn everything about a system from its propositions, you could say. But already in Bogdanov's time, that was changing. But I think that if we were to this is why it's an organizational point of view and not the point of view of symbols or language or the symbolic point of view. Because I think that even language needs to submit to organization to be useful for him, right? So language by language's sake, it will just transfer words and metaphoric uses everywhere. Some will be good, some will be bad, right? But it has no control. But it's because language is submitted to the organization of the world that you actually get specialized languages, right? So formal language, mathematics is not a richer language than natural language. Mathematics is a weaker language than natural language. The whole point of mathematics is to say less, right? You want to be able to just say what is relevant from a certain structural point of view. You don't want to say too much about the world, right? So I think that's a good example of that inverse force. It's not always about saying something general about everything, because you might have generalized too much. You might have taken something that's local and treated it as global, right? So the same time that you need the force to remove you from the world, almost like a delirium, you also need something that makes that delirium function back in the world, right? So that you can actually look into the black box of actual things. So I think that it's a different view than you can't really explain this neither with labor, because for him, animals labor, like in this sense of work, of going against the spontaneous tendency. Everything that survives goes against some spontaneous tendency. You cannot put the world on the side of spontaneity and humans on the side of labor. So he doesn't do that total distinction, but he also doesn't accept that language does that total distinction, because we would just be delirious creatures if words could be applied to anything, and that's the limit of it, right? So isn't organization a sort of combination of work and language? Like if you make language work and if you also talk about the language of work, right? You're pretty in between of the two. You get some idea of a structuring of actions, right? Something like that, which I think is the thread he tries to pull. So not all on the side of nature, be included in nature, but also not totally separated. Also not totally separated because of labor, because other animals labor, and not totally separated because of language, because if that was the case, we would be stuck, or the tendency would always be to generalization without capturing reality, right, necessarily.
So this is where I was mentioning the concept of telos in that. So I mean, it seems that for him, existence is having an organization.
Because yes, he says this even explicitly, right?
Yeah.
That complete disorganization is a concept without meaning.
Without meaning. And from a pragmatic perspective, he says that since everywhere the existence come to be realized if an organization is experiencing a resistance from another organization. Another organization comes to encounter the other organization, the existence of another organization, because of or existence of another thing, another being, because of the resistance that it exerts against the original organization. So for him, organization, every form of being, every form of existence, I should say, although that he doesn't make the distinction between being and existence, every form of existence is some form of organization. And every form of organization is formed for the purpose of the survival within the domain of nature. So we can say that probably in Bogdanov's view, the elements, or he calls the instruments of organization, one of them is word and language, is basically purposeful or useful insofar as it contributes to the main telos of the organization, which is survival. So in this case, if, for example, language exceeds its own capability in terms of basically establishing an organization, or through this exceeding, it establishes forms of organization that does not contribute to survival, then it will be extinct.
Yeah, I think that there is a distinction there, though, between, I mean, I don't think he's a teleological thinker, but I think he's very...
Doesn't make sense to me either, but it seems to...
Yeah, I think it's more about Darwin than teleology. Like, things survive if they relate to the real existing world. They don't survive because... Yeah. So I think it's about the past and not about the future.
No, by saying a telos, I'm saying organization itself is not the telos. Organization is just
the means.
A way for, it's a means for survival, and survival is what nature does, or what organisms in nature do, or
yeah,
what
I don't think
law.
that I don't think that he will put survival. I mean, I see your point. Like, the construction would be something like survival is the aim and organization is the means.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, but I think that in the way that the book...
But he doesn't say that way. I agree. And I don't like it that way. But this is for some way to conceptualize it.
Yeah, I agree that it's close to that. But it's weird because I mean, I think that the best way to deal with this is to really take seriously the idea of point of view, right? It's not so much, it's not a philosophy of organization in the sense of the true is that people are organized and that it's all about that. I think his idea is to substitute philosophy with this. So it doesn't matter why people organize. It's just that when you see from the perspective of organization, you see more. I think that's the basic statement. Like, when you see in terms of ideas, of virtue, of volition, of desire, or whatever, you see less things, or you see less connections. When you see things from the perspective of organization, you see more connections, you see more things. So, for example, I think that I would guess that as every Soviet Marxist from that time, he would have a clear answer to this problem of the telos, which is mankind's telos is to invent mankind's telos. Like, people are meant to do whatever it is that historically people designed that they should be doing. Like, it never comes to assessing the ends, I think. So I wouldn't go as far as saying that he's committed to the idea that mankind's ultimate goal is to strive with nature. Because if you read both this book and his other stuff, I mean, he's a sci-fi author and things like this. And the books are not about struggling to survive in the sense of, I would even say, I mean, this is something that I'm really interested, especially because we finished reading Badiou's book and the last chapter was called What is to Live, right? I think if you look carefully, Marxism is pretty much responsible, in my opinion. I mean, okay, you could say that religions already did this, but in a secular way, Marxism is probably the first secular thinking of how surviving is not the same as living. Like, Marxism is really not about surviving, right? Because, I mean, Marx's early writings were already pretty much about that. Like, you know, you spend your waking life working so that you can fulfill your animal necessities out of work. So all your creativity is put to in the service of survival, and you only feel alive when you're doing things that are not singular about you, right? That's like one of his first arguments in the economical philosophical manuscripts. And I think that this became a very clear kind of motto, even in Soviet art and early sort of very passionate idea that we should be doing very crazy things with our time rather than just toiling, right? I think that he fits that very nicely. And I think that one of the consequences of this idea, which is very different from Christianity, is that living doesn't need to be the contrary of surviving, right? You can imagine a society where the collective trouble of guaranteeing means of reproduction is totally connected with the most inventive spiritual tasks. You don't need to choose between the two, right? The need to choose between the two is the definite trait of bourgeois culture. It's under the division of head and hand, of manual and intellectual labor, that it seems like either you choose surviving and striving with nature or engaging in spiritual activities, right? And it's very much part of the Marxist sort of underlying project, at least in some versions of it. The very abolishing of that distinction, or at least the mixing of the two things together. So in doubt, I would put Bogdanov as part of the same thing. Like,
it's good you mentioned that, because that was exactly the point that I was puzzled about. Because at the beginning, it seems for him, the domain of subject and object doesn't seem to exist. There is no room for subject, it seems, at the beginning. Mm-hmm. Hence, there is no room for truth. So that I was puzzled about that a little bit. I'm glad you mentioned that. So I have to read the rest of it to see how within that framework, because he keeps talking about generalization. So there is like the quote that you read, there is the difference between the ways in which humans organize and nature organize is not a division, impassable division. And there is a way to generalize. Like, following Badiouian kind of framework, there is no truth in nature per se. Truth is only within the realms of activities in which there is a subject. So for me, it sounded like he has a very kind of naturalistic look into human organization and societies and stuff like that, which did not seem to jive with the kind of framework that we have been dealing with.
But I think that this is where, I mean, just consider two things that I think go not very much together in this book. It really helps when reading it. The first is that this is the guy who was engaged with the most subjectivist of Soviet projects. Like, proletarian culture, like subjective education. Like, how could he not be, if he was the sort of Spencer social evolutionist sort of guy, why would he focus on education for a new world perspective? Like, I think this book should be understood, to put it in Badiou terms, as a post-evental thing. I mean, the organizational point of view is not natural, right? That people do things organizationally is absolutely impossible to avoid, but there is something that you need to engage with. It's a point of view. It's not a necessary point of view, right? So I think it should be read the way that it was written, right? In the middle of a revolution. It's not a book of social science. Mm-hmm. Though the language of politics in Soviet Russia was the language of science many times, right? So I think that it's important to distinguish the language of this is an impartial perspective on the world that takes into consideration nature, sociality, and so on. And the fact that this is, let's say, being pushed forward by the Bolshevik leader during a crazy period of revolution, and to the point that the guy died doing it, right? So I agree the terminology doesn't fit so much, but so the first thing I think to consider is this, that there is a specific political project that followed from it, right? And it's a political project that I think has the first basic premise that you derive from reading this is that there is a political position that doesn't see material substrate so much as forms of organization, right? So as he says right at the beginning, when he says that there is a political perspective which concerns the struggle of organizational forms, which I already lost where it is, right? This quote here. I think that this connects, let's say, to the political perspective. It is a wager on politics. Like, look at things from the organizational point of view. That gives you the truth, rather than look at it some other way, right? But second, I think that there is a consequence to if we go to that drawing again. In this drawing, I'm sorry to belabor this point because I know it's perhaps a bit too specific, but for people who are following Badiou, you know that there is this duality that he criticizes, right? Between what he calls the idealist aristocracy of thinking that truths are outside of the world, they are something special and unique and purely exceptional. And there is what he calls democratic materialism that treats humanity just as a sort of species of animals, like every other species, and it's pretty much about preservation. We should preserve everyone because preservation is what we have in common. The sort of ultra-naturalism of humanity. And he defines truth as the imbrication of a common exception. So it's interesting because in Bogdanov, every time you do something exceptional, you should take the standpoint that you're common, right? The standpoint where humanity advances is the standpoint where it sees itself most common to nature. So it's weird that the more you are able to say how common you are, the more different you become, right? So the more we thought we were different from nature in an absolute way, the less different we really were. The more this sort of naturalist organizational perspective kind of develops, the more actually exceptional you become, like the more you do something different, right? So there's a strange interplay between the common and the exceptional in his perspective, I think. I don't think it's simply naturalism in the sense that, oh, we're bound to do things because it's in our nature, because we're natural beings, and that's it. And it's also not humans are superior, we do things to dominate. It's like there is this logic where the deeper you go into the way nature is organized, the more separate from nature you are. So the more you learn about nature, the more denaturalized you are. But this is a logic. This is not an essence. So if any other animal were to do this, they would go through some denaturalization process just like us. So it's both special in the sense that it's one thing, it's different from other things, but it's also not essential, I think.
Another interesting place where this connects with Badiou, and I think it's really interesting in terms of what you're saying, Gabriel, around like Bogdanov kind of proposing to replace philosophy with the organizational point of view, is when he talks about the idea, which he defines as it always appears as an organizational scheme. This is on page 3. And then he goes on to basically list 3 of the 4 conditions of truth. He says technical rule, but he describes it as coordinating the efforts of people in a direct and manifest fashion, scientific knowledge, and artistic conception. And so he kind of brings the organizational view to the idea and links something like truth procedures at the top of page 3.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I think that in my opinion, there is I don't want to like focus on this too much because it's not like everyone needs to be interested in Badiou, but I find it quite amazing that you can totally read Badiou's project under the same light. And I think that this is actually what distinguishes him very much from a lot of contemporary science, philosophy, because, you know, Badiou has this very strong idea that philosophy does not produce new truths, that philosophy needs to learn about what is true on other fields, and its only task is to systematize truths that are not philosophical, right? And he puts philosophy in a smaller place than other fields, that they are the inventive ones. For him, philosophy doesn't invent anything, it comes after, but in a way that is not even Hegelian, like things happen in politics and then philosophy says the truth about them. No, things happen in politics. Politics says what's truth about politics, and then philosophy needs to learn how politics does its stuff. Science does something, science learns how to speak the truth about science, and then we learn about it afterwards. And in that way, it's very different, for example, from Deleuzian or other philosophical procedures, contemporary, where philosophy helps everyone to be autonomous. Like it's the motivating force for creativity. It's connected to creativity. And I think that this role of philosophy in Badiou is very much like philosophy in the age of specialization. You cannot know beforehand what science will do. You cannot be up to date with all scientific endeavors. You cannot know beforehand what is political. You cannot know what art is going to do. You can come afterwards and try to systematize what is compossible, right, between all those things. In that way, it's very similar, right, in this idea that, look, it's not, I see some connections. The first one is this idea that there is no total disorganization. That's Badiou's theory of the count as one, right? Every situation is structured. Then you have this idea that if you want to have a general point of view, something like a general ontology, it won't be an ontology of relations, not an ontology of substance. It will be something like the theory of structures, right? Because the most different things have in common is that they're structured. And the third point is that there is no content. This theory cannot not have one content because structures are so different. There are infinite ways this can happen that the best you can do is come afterwards, right? So that point that Bogdanov makes about communism cannot be a modern system. The theory of knowledge in communism cannot be the theory of a unified system because there are infinite systems that are infinitely different. So it can only be a theory of the systematicity of systems, something like this, right? The theory of the most basic stuff that any system has to deal with, without saying that they're all the same, right? So this is why for him, he says things like, on page 30, he says something like, which is very weird. He says, there is no essential difference between material and abstract instruments, right? Or structures, organizations. And then later on, he will say, talking about natural selection, I'm not sure if this is where it is, but he talks about, okay, selection is perhaps a bit too general concept here, but he talks about we don't need a theory of natural selection, because there is a general theory of selection that applies both to nature and to artificial systems. So it's a very kind of abstracted point of view that says only the things that are not relevant to, this is not where it is. I don't know where it is. That all systems have in common, right? Yeah, but I can't really find the quote here. If I'm not mistaken, it's on part 3.
Gabriel,
Yeah.
just going back to the drawing again, I remember another meeting that you talked about the difference between the philosophical and economical manuscripts and Capital, when you said that in the first one, Marx went from the homogeneous elements to the heterogeneous elements. And in Capital, he does the opposite, and it's something similar from what you just did in the drawing, saying that when you take the organizational point of view, you will go to from like the heterogeneous point of view to a common point of view that is when everybody is connected, because everybody feels the resistance of trying to dominate the natural forces.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just thinking about the difference between this Bogdanov's view and the view from Capital, because what is common in Capital? I think what is common is that we are connected because the same thing surpasses us.
Mm-hmm.
And I think here's is another definition of common, better definition maybe, but I don't know. I don't know.
No, I find that very interesting, because I think, in my opinion, is that I think Marx had one of the most troubling moments in his life when he realized, I imagine, when he realized that his definition of the generic applies better to Capital than to anything. Like, the only place where he uses the same expression, like in the economic philosophical manuscripts, he talks about genericity as the capacity for people to do one thing, and in doing that thing, change the very thing that is doing, right? Humans do things through labor, but they change what it means to be human by doing those things. So it's kind of autopoietic, right? It's a feedback structure. The more you do something outward, it changes inward. But in Capital, there's only one thing that has that feedback structure, which is self-valorization, right? Capital is kind of posits itself and then changes itself. So I wonder how sad it must have been to take your favorite concept from your youth and then apply it to capital rather than to, you know, humanity. It must have been very kind of ironic, sad moment for him. And I think that Dennis asked about capital in this chapter, and you don't see any of it, right? And I think that from what I read in this book, I never read the whole thing. You get things like, how does capitalism appear from the organizational point of view? It will appear as, at the level of epistemology, so organization of experience, it will be a specialized epistemology. You only know, you have such a restricted experience that you only know about a very small region of what is known, right? The field of the known is always bigger than what you know. You can never learn what humanity already knows, let's say. So there is a sort of restriction at the level of experience. There is the issue at the level of production. There is the problem of division of labor that he treats a lot. There is a lot about competition because, so from the organizational point of view, capitals in the plural appear as competition. So let's say it's almost treated as a form of social selection of organizations, right? It's something that Dennis was talking about the other day. And I think that it's very fitting that for the concrete empirical, let's say, because it's funny, Bogdanov says the problem with philosophy is that it's not empirical. There are no philosophical experiments. And tektology is different from philosophy because there are tektological experiments. So it seems like he's an empiricist, but then he says, I'm no empiricist for the individual senses. It's not like the senses of our body are what makes something empirical, because there are experiments that happen at the level of organizations or happen through scientific instruments. They don't happen through your perceptive organs, right? But it still is, for him, competition is an empirical category for tektology, because if from the organizational point of view, you see organizations relating in ways that seem at first to increase their efficiency and then to decrease the way energy is distributed in society, things like this. So, but it's weird because it's almost like there are no totalizing concepts. It's weird, like capitalism appears as we being poor in our capacity to know, we being competitive and looking only very closely, like it's very kind of crappy at coordinating, right? It looks at its neighbor and tries to get the best out of it, and then you see in the long run that a crisis appears, right? But it's never like a big unified machinery. It's strange. And I think that sometimes this is good because you see the idea that the organizational point of view sees more, right? It doesn't see like we are trapped in this system. It never appears like that. But it's also perhaps not as good because financial capital and more abstract forms of capital might not appear so directly in this way. So probably there is more to do than simply stay at that level, right, of analysis. But it's very strange how it emerges, I think.
Yeah, and thinking about Dennis' question about where is capital, and thinking about what you just said, when there is no totalization, how can you talk about something like capital?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, I remember from, let me just see if I can find something here, because I remember in other texts, I mean, he wrote a lot about capital due to you know, his books on political economy and so on. So there are some references. Let's just, why not just check them out very quickly. So for example, in the part that we already read, so in this chapter, he says this, about when he's talking about machines, right?
And about production.
Yeah. One thing that I like, just before we get there, he says, let's see if I can find it.
Actually, before we even talk about capital, I just realized that it works just as well to say that the instruments of organization provide a theory of use value, in the sense that even things that you consume for your own personal enjoyment can be thought of as organization of enjoyment, right? Instruments of organization of enjoyment, say, not to mention the production of other things being organizing nature or whatever, right?
Yeah,
So, I mean, you have that even like before you get to capital and this more complex forms. Organization can be thought, you know, even at this basic level of consuming things. I don't know how that fits with what you
Yeah,
guys
I
were
think,
saying.
I mean, in the part that it's not in this book, but I think I'll find the other version of it. I think Renzo has it. In the end of the Tektology book, the big one, there is an addendum called Organization and Labor, where his critique is exactly this, that capital is incapable of connecting social reproduction and labor. He says the only way to see the worker as an organization is to see the consumption and production as part of the same system. Like if you separate the worker between the worker as producer and then the worker as consumer, you actually divide one system into two. But then you won't be able to understand things about that system. So he makes a critique that the wage system of payment connects before it connects workers, it disconnects two parts of the worker system, right? So I think that it definitely goes together with what you're saying, Dennis. Like there is an organizational point of view for consumption and use and so on. And he even uses this to explain why, because for him there will be no division of labor will never end, right? It has a natural, it has a concrete reason. It's impossible to get the best out of work if people don't pay attention to one thing, at least for some time. And it's true that some works make you expend more energy than others. So it makes sense that some people need to eat more than others. For him, that's not a problem. Of course, everyone should eat what they need to, but the needs won't be homogenized. So he goes very far with the to each according to their needs, from each according to their ability. But so I think that there is a lot there. But for example, this example here, he talks about industrial capitalistic system of production, and he talks about positive selection. So the industrial system of, under conditions of positive selection, prosperity, has certain definitive properties. These properties are sharply replaced by others with the approach of an industrial crisis, and the sign of selection becomes negative. So he treats competition and monopoly and a bunch of economic categories as being the economic manifestation of a general principle that appears in other places, like organization of ideas, organization of species, and things like this. And it's always weird how it needs to be similar, right? Because there is something in common from the organizational point of view, but it's never the same. It's always different because there's something specific about economy that is different from the relation between species, right? So there's actually a lot of references to capital. Let's see if we can find some like more. Yeah, I know that another thing, I think I know that he has a very polemic explanation of World War I. He was one of the first guys in Soviet uh, uh, politics to explain it like Hilferding, by putting financial capital in like the front point, you know. So, I mean, he's not very vulgar in his political economy. He was actually quite sophisticated. So it's weird that when he's talking about tektology, that's not in the forefront. Like, it's really not the same as economy. I think that's also why it's not so in the center, you know. I just wanted to find, there's a really cool quote.
Do you think part of that is polemical? Like you're saying that this was written in a time of revolution, like trying to dislocate the constant centralizing of theory during the Soviet era on economics and really trying to like pull organization outside of starting with economics always?
Yeah, I have that impression because I mean, from two perspectives. Like, first, because there was, even amongst other Soviet thinkers, the idea that they had new problems, right? Like Probachevsky was writing on socialist economy. They were trying to think the problems ahead in the best sense, like being very optimistic. What will we face in a new society? There were many people thinking about that, and I think that justified focusing somewhere else. But I also think that he was very, very committed to this idea that, I mean, I wanted to find a quote. I know that there is a not so amazing version of it in the beginning, but there is one later on that is better. But he's talking about, I think on page 20 something, he's talking about specialization of labor, right? And he says, how geometry appeared. He explains mathematics precisely as a sort of, and I mean, we can take this very far, man, because he gives a theory of the birth of mathematics out of the generalization from specific practical situations, right? You measure with some land here, you measure something else there, suddenly you start developing, by looking at what they have in common, a theory of measurement in general, right? But if you look at the history of mathematics, which is very much a complex mixture of algebra and geometry all the time, right? Today, category theory was kind of created to be the most sophisticated theory of how to import structures from one part of mathematics to another, right? It is all about isomorphisms, and it's a kind of, though it's not meant to be only this, but it also is a generalization from model theory, it seems to me, right? Of how do you stop focusing on how one thing models another, and you get a general theory of how to encode information from one system into another system, and only focus on the encoding and let go of the interior description. That's the sort of technology for generalizing structure in mathematics. So it's it has a very similar flavor to this first moment, which was, let's say, coming up with mathematical realm or geometrical realm out of the generalization of specific situations. But then once you have geometry and as a separate branch, it itself specializes into parts of geometry that don't really go together, like algebraic geometry, Euclidean geometry and non-Euclidean geometry and all these things. And then you again need some other form of finding what is common about all those specialized versions, right? The thing that I wanted to find here that I think is useful is that he says this, right? So he just described this specificization of the world, this sort of tension between bourgeois ideology of generalization, no, bourgeois ideology of specialization and popular kind of culture of generalization, right? So for him, capitalist world is kind of divided, or early capitalism, late feudalism, or whatever, it's kind of divided between these two things. The increasing specificity in the cities, increasing specificity in professions, being an artisan of a specific thing, learning to do one thing, one trade, and a sort of popular tektology, as he talked, right? Popular sayings, superstitions, everything that connects everyone together. And then he talks about the limit of specialization, so which is kind of talking about the limit of division of labor, right? It says, specialization has led to tremendous development of the collective forces of mankind in labor and cognition. It had, however, a limited motive power for progress. Along with conditions facilitating and accelerating progress, specialization also contains retarding conditions. At first, their impact was negligible, but in the course of time, this impact has grown to such an extent that now it is being converted into the present deep contradiction, which costs mankind so dearly. The benefit of specialization comes from economy of efforts. You learn to do things spending less energy, right? The worker doesn't scatter them in various directions, but concentrates them. So because the field of organization experience is narrower, you only experience less, mastery over it becomes easier. The acquisition of skills and methods becomes faster. Nevertheless, along with the economy of effort comes their dissipation, which is at first imperceptible but inescapable from the very beginning. It flows from the weakening of bonds amongst people and the connectedness of their experience. And then he starts talking about the sort of problem of specialization, which makes capitalist division of labor actually a crappy way of doing this, right? And then he talks about how language is changed under specialization and the impossibility of transferring methods from one place to the other because it's too complex, it's too separate, and there's nothing in common, right? So it's a nice way of framing a problem of capitalism in as if it's like just a problem in the world. Like it's just one thing, it does very good one part of the operation and very badly the other one. It specializes a lot, increases complexity, but is not capable of transmitting the information of the complexity that it itself created, right? So nothing gets transformed, nothing gets passed along. So I just like this because I think it goes, John, to what you were saying, this sort of way of showing capitalism as a specific thing rather than the general condition. And just saying like, until now, this was done in this way, right? But the problem is the background problem. It's not a capitalist problem. I think that ultimately this is what makes Bogdanov so interesting, is that the problems are problems of man with nature. Capitalism is a solution to a problem that is bigger than capitalism. And it's a kind of crappy solution when seen from that perspective. Like, so you're not trying to solve capitalism's problems. You're trying to solve the problems of man's relation to nature better than capitalism, right? So I think that that's very different. Like,
this is very similar. This is very similar from Apolito's problem too.
Yes, totally.
Yeah.
Right. So I would say something like you have this sort of nature here and society here, and nature is defining society, but at the same time there is some connection, and this is a big problem. And then you have one solution, which is capitalism, and it does some things good, some things bad, but it's not like you're trying to say like inequality is here and you're trying to solve it with communism, right? Communism goes here. So it's not determined by capitalist social relations, it's determined by this other thing here. And I think that that's kind of like the point of view change, right? You're not really, there is the point of politics, and I think that that's also, it's also strange to think of it in this way, because socialist politics is so defined by correcting the mistakes of a social system that it's very, even at its best, it's very reactive, right? Like the world is like this, I'm making capitalism accountable. It's a dialogue with capital. And I think that for Bogdanov and this sort of idea that society is almost like a adventure within nature, right? You're doing something that can go wrong in nature, and how to go about it. It makes politics more affirmative, like who will solve this better, right? Rather than how do I make up for the mistakes of the past. It's a slightly different approach. I think it has more, it's more enthusiastic in a certain sense, I think, you know. And I think it also avoids very nicely this sort of, you know, even though he's a conservative, I think sometimes he captures very well this idea. You know, that Peter Sloterdijk guy, he wrote this book called Rage in Time. I don't know how it's called in Portuguese. O Banco da Ira, the deposit of rage. And his theory is that it's very hard for the left to imagine a reason to do politics that is not rage. But he's not making like the critique of, oh, you guys are so aggressive. It's slightly different. His point is that, and he's quite conservative, so he's kind of making it kind of a very mean sort of approach. But his idea is that this is an economy. Rage has because of what Nietzsche said about resentment has an economical dimension. And you guys will only be able to go as far as resentment allows. Like the moment that resentment is not economically viable, like it doesn't pay to do things because you're either like revenging yourself or getting back, there will be no stamina to do things. And I think that Bogdanov is a good counterpart to this. You know, there is not much place for resentment. Like there is a sort of almost a view that capitalism, it's always like this point, like it was okay, but it's not all that. You know, it's like, it's not the best thing. It's not so good, you know. It's a strange perspective, I think. I think that might explain a bit why he's not so attached to the Soviet praise of the industrial worker, and he had better ties with the peasants and so on, and a sort of change of sensibility, because it's not really kind of let's revenge everything that was taken from us. It has a different feel to it. I don't know.
It's kind of more important to him to create the terrain that you were talking about than...
Yeah, I think he's more like that. And I find it so beautiful that it's totally tragic and comical, really, that the guy died doing blood transfusions with people.
Yeah, he really believed in the homogeneity principle.
Yeah, so it's crazy, yeah. But I don't know. From this chapter, there are some things we can, as we move along, we can also talk. I mean, for people who are following this whole philosophical debate on correlationism and Quentin Meyassu's critique of the subject-object relation, it's quite amazing that he makes a critique of Kant based on that, and a critique of analytic philosophy before it was born. I don't know if you guys saw this. Like he says that there are two big theories on part 5, contemporary thought and the idea of general unity of organizational methods, right? And he talks about Kantian philosophy as a sort of subjectivism that doesn't accept structure in the world. So it doesn't accept objective structure as a given, even though it depends on it. So he makes a critique of it. And then he makes a critique of philological and symbolical philosophy. right? The idea that language is the thing that actually determines structure as well. So it's very contemporary, the debate, like trying to justify why organization is not the same as transcendental categories of thought. We organize things with our mind, and it's also not language that gives organization, because if the organization is not there, language cannot do anything about it. And it's funny that in that point, he's criticizing Poincaré, like his reference is Poincaré, is not like some small guy.
Yeah, I mean, you can find a lot of crazy things in this like first chapter. He anticipates Turing. I think he also kind of anticipates Chomsky with like pretty much like a universal grammar, right? Based on
there is some universal grammar. Yes.
Of organization, yeah. So it's like everything.
He wrote. There is the part on primitive words. It's like exactly what Freud was doing like 2 years before. There is an actual text by Freud dealing with exactly the same thing. Reading a anthropologist of language that was friends with the guy that Bogdanov quoted. Like he was very much in the know of the moment. It's very different from Lenin. In fact, I mean, I love Lenin, but imperial criticism is kind of embarrassing. Like, not to say totally embarrassing. And also Bogdanov was reading like Einstein in the year that his first papers were published, that on relativity and so on. He was really keeping up to date, you know. One thing that I think we will have to talk about later on, but I think we can wait a bit, is that the main guy behind Bogdanov's approach is Ernst Mach, right? The scientist and philosopher of science who posed Newton on the idea that time and space are kind of absolute coordinate systems, right? Which ultimately influenced Einstein as well, right? It's very arguable how much Einstein was actually influenced by Mach, or if it's just like a retroactive thing. He said, that guy also thought something in this direction. But it's very interesting to see that there is a very strong influence of a sort of relativism in Bogdanov, right? What counts as matter, what counts as form, what counts as agency, what counts as resistance, it's all relative to the organization that is being analyzed. Like, you can have things that look totally different from two perspectives. Like, one organization, from the perspective of humans, we're walking on inert ground, but if you look at a different scale, there's a lot of transformation going, and there is no such thing as stable inert stuff. So it's very connected as well, the idea of organization and the idea of reference frame. And I think that it would be worth at some point, as we move, to perhaps just stop a bit and talk about Ernst Mach and Richard Avenarius, who was another philosopher he quoted a lot, because they were very relevant to this sort of I think the way that organization came to the fore, because his critique of Kant has a lot to do with that, right? There is no general transcendental structure, because transcendental structures are in history and they're being changed because they're just forms of organizing experience, right? That change is similar to what Mach does to Newton, in saying that these things are not absolute frames. The actual measurement of time and measurement of space is part of what constructs the concept of time and space, depending on how measurements are made and the way that we can construct experiments and so on. So there is a sort of relativization of what counts as transcendental for a given situation. So, and it's very nice to see that there is a connection both with what was happening in physics and what he was proposing. And I think ultimately this is why he will choose to focus on organization rather than labor. Labor implies a sort of, labor is a very Newtonian concept to begin with, right? And organization is already a bit more complicated, because let's say, if there is work, or if the general tendency is entropic, actually becomes more interactional than substantial, right? Because, for example, you can have a very complicated system where parts of it are going against entropy, but globally it's actually entropic. Things get much more kind of localized, I think. So I think that there is a nice story to be told about this sort of change in the way physics was being thought, change in the way that he moves from work to organization, and also change in this sort of slightly different view of experience and its connection to experimentation against the sort of transcendental view of experience, right? I think that's all kind of in the background of what we're reading, but I think it will become clearer later on, hopefully.
But if you guys have some suggestion on what to read about Mach, please.
I have a couple of things. I'll send you guys.
Okay.
It's really, really amazing. The guy people hated him apparently, but apparently he was a very annoying person. But I'll send you guys some links.
Okay.
Great. Yeah, I always heard of this guy, but I never read him.
I'll send you guys. There is something that ultimately was called the Mach principle, that actually is Einstein's terminology for it. So Einstein did give the guy a lot of credit, but we'll see. I'll send you guys some stuff. Let me know what you think. Great, guys.
Take care, everyone.
Yeah, y'all have a good night or day.
Good night. A good day for you, John.
Yeah, good day.
Good morning.
Day, yeah.
See ya.
All right,
Bye-bye.
take care.
All right, night.